Hello, everyone. Afternoon. So fab to see you all this afternoon, and hello, everyone on live stream. So my name, as we said, was Carly Richmond. I'm a developer advocate at Elastic, and also I used to be a front-end engineer who would dabble in back-end services where needed in an investment bank. And that's really where a lot of the experiences that I'm going to draw on with my story today really come in. Because there was two questions I always really struggled with when I was building applications, not just for internal users, but for external facing ones as well. I always wanted to know, are the features I'm building actually being used? You know, they've told me they are, but is that actually happening? And I also wanted an idea of what the performance of my apps were. You know, was it considered a good experience? Was it a bad experience? What are the benchmarks? What are the errors? So I'm going to talk about various different tools and techniques that we have within the ecosystem to do this, what particular considerations we need to have with these things for React applications as well. And I'll have a link at the end for code snippets, but if anyone has any questions, I'll be around at the end, or feel free to contact me on the usual channels. Cool. So this is where my clicker stops working. That's fine. So I'm going to apologize in advance because it's end of September and I am going to talk about Christmas. Apologies in advance. So as I said, I used to work in a bank. I worked during a time when we had large agile transformations at an enterprise level. And that meant that I worked either in a mixture of Kanban, Scrum, or Waterfall. Now, irrespective for obviously any agile techniques, I would end up working with clients and going through kind of reviews every few weeks to show them what was new and to try and gain feedback. And I don't know about you, but I found that these are really similar to gift giving at Christmas or maybe birthdays, you know, if it's a bit too early for you. So if they loved it, if they thought the features were great, I would get the yatter. I would get them saying, oh, this is fantastic. Maybe they want other particular things they want to add on to the top. I would hear about it even after. They're like, oh, this helped me with this part of my job. So they were really chatty and optimistic and positive about it. But think about that situation where you get given that really hideous, itchy looking Christmas jumper that you know is going to get put away to the charity bag when you get home. Not very many of us turn out to our relative who's given it and said, this isn't really for me, but thank you very much. Does anyone do that? No. And we don't do that with the features we're building either quite often. Maybe it's different. In fact, it is different when it's an external audience because it's less personal. But see, if you're building with internal people in mind and you're going through these regular reviews, chances are they're not giving you that negative feedback. So do you know when you're going to find out about that? Well, you're going to find out maybe never, you don't know. Because you end up with this lack of feedback, just churning out the same stuff over and over again. You get into what's called the feature factory mindset. And then it's all fine for a while. And then everything blows up. Maybe you end up finding about that issue far more later. Maybe you end up with flashing red lights and sirens. Has anyone got those in their office? No. And that's too late. I don't want to find out about those then. I'd like to stay as far away from outage calls as possible. I've been in far too many for my time, been pulled in last minute. I want to find out about potential performance degradation as early as I can. I want to find out they're not using things as early as I can. But that was not my experience. For roughly about 10 years, we never really considered front-end or back-end observability. And we're really missing out because do you know when we find out about these things? When it blows up. So once upon a time, in a very large investment bank, that's exactly what happened to me. With someone calling up, yelling, going, stuff doesn't work, we've not changed this. We deployed these features with your collaboration. Everything was fine in the review. I don't know what's going on. So we needed to figure this out. But when we check the back-end logs, because we have no metrics and traces at this time, you look and you see, well, everything's ticking through. This server call's coming back in a matter of milliseconds. So there's something else that's going on. But I can see it's slow. I can see it's slow in production. So how do I figure this out? And this was the first time that I ever saw Google Lighthouse. So who's actively using Google Lighthouse? Okay, so a few of us. How many are using them as part of your CI pipelines? Even less hands, so that's interesting. So this is Google Lighthouse within the context of your browser. So it's a tool that's readily available. But you can pick up the reports it generates in a lot of different places, in CI pipelines, as I alluded to with that question, or even in other domains such as certain deployment ecosystems such as Netlify have inbuilt plugins. So you can actually see these reports very easily. And the reason that you want to see these is because of what's called Google Core Web Vitals. So how many people have heard of Google Core Web Vitals? More hands than are using Lighthouse. This is interesting. Maybe a discussion for after. So for anyone who's not familiar, these are basically a set of metrics that are meant to give an indication of the performance of your site at a high level. They've been around since 2020. They also were included as part of the ranking criteria for Google in June of 2021. So if anyone has anyone from marketing saying, oh, but what about SEO? There's at least a partial idea here that you need to think about, not just the performance angle. So if you need to sell it, there's another idea. So I'm going to run through super quick, since half of us have heard about these and half of us have not, about what the three primary metrics are. So the first is largest contentful paint. And this is an indication of that initial performance when a user is going to access your site. So it's the render time of the largest image or text block visible within the viewport. Ideally, this should be under 2.5 seconds because, well, we've all done it when we're using sites ourselves. If we don't have something pop up, if something's not showing us that this site is alive, we might think it's down or unavailable. We might refresh, we might come back later, which is not very good if you want to try and entice people to use your site. The second thing is called first input delay, and this is about the reactiveness to user input. We've all been in that situation where you're not sure if that click's been registered and then you start key mashing the thing. Just me being impatient? No? Okay. So first input delay is basically the time taken from when the user inputs a particular action and the page is actually executing it. So ideally, you want to give them some form of response within 100 milliseconds to say that the app is actually alive. And then the last one, which took me a while to figure out until I had a rather weird situation where I connected my son's Bluetooth headphones to my neighbour's television via Bluetooth instead of my iPad when he was wanting to watch Paw Patrol. Cumulative layout shift. So we don't want elements moving around the page unexpected because then that leads to inadvertent errors, such as me connecting to the living room TV rather than the iPad. So basically what happens is over the entire lifetime of your page, the shift of layout in your page, basically the ratio of how much your page moves around is calculated, and then the maximum is taken as that CLS value for your page. And that ideally should be under 0.1. So Google Lighthouse is great. Some people are using it, some people are not. Using it in your CI pipeline to track the delta of these particular measures over time can give you an indication of perhaps where new features have caused a degradation in the app performance. But there's a couple of limitations associated with this. So normally when we're running these, or at least in my own experience from my own story, it's because we've already detected that something's not quite right. So it's not really going to preempt you and give you a rough idea. The second thing is we're running these in situations where we're not really able to capture it based on the user traffic, i.e. what users are actually doing. So there's an element of kind of mystery associated with that. So we want to capture what users are doing. We want to see if an app is going to respond to that. So the opposing extreme is to look at something called synthetic monitoring. So who's heard of synthetic monitoring? Cool, I've got a few. So how many people would consider synthetic monitoring to be more of a back-end thing, like pinging of services? A couple, okay. Good, so that's how I traditionally thought about it, but the reality is with the emergence of what's called scripted monitors, we're able to do cooler things. So if you make use of end-to-end testing frameworks or tools, things like Playwright or perhaps Selenium if you're a bit more old school, if you use a scripted monitor that's compatible with an observability platform, such as the case is with Playwright and Elastic Synthetics, then you're able to write something that you can use as an end-to-end test to capture the real user clicks and events to see that the page is behaving to user input as you expect. And then you can deploy it as a monitor, which is useful for two reasons. It means that you can actually see the errors. So if there's a failing assertion in that test on a production system, you're able to see quickly what's going on. That can trigger an alert that will report you that you need to stand up and see what's going on. But as you can probably guess from this little duration by step chart in the corner, we can look for degradation. One of the biggest problems I had when I used to write end-to-end tests was over time, we'd end up having to randomly add in extra timeouts because the tests were running slower and slower and slower, and we weren't sure why. So being able to start catching that and perhaps be alerted to that before that happens is a useful thing, not just in the end-to-end testing scenario, but also in the production management example if you're working with an SRE. But that doesn't always give us everything we want, because when we code up these end-to-end tests, we assume what a user is going to do. And they don't always do what we think they're going to do they? Otherwise, we wouldn't have to put in error handling. So we need to have an idea of what the real traffic is, which means it's time to crack out the RUM. And I'm not meaning the favorite beverage of my friend Jack here. Cue the dad joke. This is more about real user monitoring. So real user monitoring is where you're using an agent embedded within your JavaScript application to capture things like errors, navigation information, and trace information, so that you have a more holistic picture of what is going on as a user is actually using your application. So this example that I've got is using the Elastic RUM agent along with the Elastic observability, because I am from Elastic. But observability platforms, most will have some form of real user monitoring agent that will send directly into your observability platform. So go and have a look. And as you saw from Kent's ecosystem for Epic Stack this morning, if you're using Grafana, go and have a look at Faro from Grafana, because they have an agent as well. The general idea is that we make use of a RUM agent that's specific to the particular observability vendor. And that's because at the moment, there is no open standard. There is working groups and a lot of collaboration that I see going on in the CNCF Foundation at the moment. But right now, it's not quite there yet. So as a call to action, if anyone cares about this and wants to have a more open standard, go and see if you can get involved. I'm sure they'd be more than happy. But the basic idea is that you'll have an agent running as part of your JavaScript React app that will send this telemetry information to an integration server, persist the results into a store. So in this case, it would be Elasticsearch, obviously, and then obviously show the results in Kibana. And if you want to have a real idea of what's going on, think back to my story about scanning through to try and figure out where the degradation is between the front-end application and the back-end services. Then it's also worth having a look at using a back-end agent. And in that case, I would recommend having a look at the OpenTelemetry agents available via CNCF. So we'll run through a quick snippet of how to do this. Again, have a look at your particular provider, but a lot of the configurations are pretty similar. Basically, download the package for the appropriate agent. So in this case, it's the Elastic APM RUM, and then initialize it with the service name. You can think about if you're in a massive system with loads of different smaller microservices. I'm not getting into the microservice monolith argument, but if you are, then you need to be able to know what this particular component is that you're looking at. The RUM agent by default runs on a single origin. So in order to enable the appropriate HTTP headers for cross-origin requests, you need to use this distributed tracing origins option that I've got here on line number 5. Specify where it's going, so which Elastic deployment, which observability platform is it going to. And then optionally, you can check out the service version environment. So if you are basically running these things across multiple different environments and you want to compare, perhaps you've got a blue-green deployment and you're trying to do experiments around what's happening in one environment versus another, then obviously knowing what environment this data is coming from to allow you to compare is important. So make sure you use those options if needed. Sometimes for these agents, you do need to make use of framework-specific extensions. And that's because between the different myriad of frameworks we've got in the JavaScript ecosystem, there's different things that you might need to consider. So with React, obviously, routing is a big thing. So there is the framework extension that you need to make use of as well, which is where this APM routes addition comes into my router configuration. And that will then capture the appropriate routes. You might have the situation as well where you need to configure for individual components. So maybe you're introducing kind of particular button click events and you want more detailed than just click on this random div. And in those kind of instances, you can make use of custom transactions that you can raise within the code snippets as well. So make sure to look out for the framework extensions for these things. And then just for completeness, I said we needed to have a backend service. So you'll make use of an APM agent as well, and then specify that it's going to be your backend service as well. And you'll see why when we get to tracing that you'll be able to see all of these. So, as I said, I worked in banking for 10 years, and then for just a year and a bit, I've been at Elastic. So if I could go back in time, hopefully in a DeLorean, classic car, I would hopefully want to use these tools to solve a myriad of different problems that I had. Because we think about just basic things like error detection, but the whole point of this talk is that we can use this information to get insights into what our users are actually doing with their applications. So let me go through, reminisce, and I'll tell you some stories. So I want to go back to that slow point, okay? In a crisis situation like that, you want to try and resolve that as quickly as possible because everyone is breathing down your neck, you're panicking, and you're trying to basically figure out what's going on in the fly. So you need access to data. Especially if you're new. If you're new on a team and this is your first outage situation, trying to use instincts that you don't have yet is just not going to work. So we need to access to those metrics on the live traffic, not just on a random page through Google Lighthouse. So what you'll have is that RUM agents will capture these core web vitals for you, capture page load stats, allow you to compare potentially between an instance running last week when you thought everything was fine so that you can catch quickly if there's been a degradation in the application performance. And again, it's against the live traffic, so you're not trying to recreate this in a pre-production environment to see what's going on. Second thing is tracing information. So remember I said use RUM for front-end observability and also use it for the back-end services for APM. There's a reason for that. There's no point instrumenting your back-end services, having all this rich information on what's going on, and then having nothing on the front end. And genuinely, in my experience, that's what's happened. It's always been an afterthought to try and get more insights out of what's happening on the front end. So you'll see in this example here, this is the tracing that I've got. So just like the core pillars of observability, you have kind of the high-level trace for a return of the records. So I can see in green all of the loading elements. So I can see how much time it's taking for individual JavaScript files to load. I can see how long it's taking by comparison for my backend service controller to get the responses back. And from there, I have a live picture of what's going on. So I can see other things like retries, duplicate calls, all sorts of interesting things, but I have it as a holistic picture now for the entire application and not just for the backend services. Now, this is not meant to be malicious. It's definitely not. But the fact of the matter is, I would always get conflicting accounts as to what particular features people were using. I'd ask one person, they're like, oh, I use this every day. It's fantastic. Yes, it's given me great benefits to how I work. And then I'll speak to someone else in the same team doing the same function who would go, oh, no, I've just been using spreadsheets. The joys of banking. And the fact is that that can be done for a multitude of factors. Think about that curve we always get talked about with regards to product adoption, with your early innovators and then those that are late to the party. The same thing happens with the features that we build as well. And we need data to try and see what's going on. Is a feature actually being used? And also, is it being used if and when we expect it to be? So did you build a feature that was meant on an e-commerce platform for a big blowout sale in the summer? And then it wasn't used, but maybe it was used in a quiet period, maybe in September, pre-Black Friday. This is useful information. So RUM agents will capture view information and will aggregate it so that you get an idea, as you can see in this screenshot, of what the total number of page views are. Then if you make use of transactions and other things, you can actually look at it from an individual feature level. So is there particular sections of the page that are being accessed to particular options that are being clicked. If you build out a rich ecosystem for your observability, you should be able to see what's happening in your front-end app. Sometimes stuff falls over. I had a rather nasty situation with a colleague where a service just stopped working. Now, this was a Java app, disclaimer, but the point is that this still happens, where we have services that fall over and our app is then, bringing us back errors saying, services are unavailable, contact support. And then you're trying to figure out why. And then if it keeps happening, you continue to figure out why. Now, in some instances, you then have to end up trying to profile the app, recreate the traffic to see what's happening. Or sometimes in the case of this app where it was Java, I had to basically take a heap dump from production and we had to profile it to see what the state of the ecosystem was. And until then, we were playing guessing games of how much we needed to increase the memory footprint of the app within the container. Sometimes that's why combining these back-end service metrics with the front end is important, because you need to see the whole system. You can't just focus on our bit, especially in a high pressure situation where you're dealing with an outage. So one of the things that's useful when you capture them from OpenTelemetry agents is you can see the various different measures, such as the usage, number of requests, etc. Being able to see these to try and plan for spikes ahead of time, perhaps look at events in the past to anticipate demand, can be super useful and also gives you a full picture of what's going on in the app. We always joke about it works on my machine, right? What if it doesn't work on a particular user's machine? One user. Run away and cry. So I had one situation before where I had one user, the app was just showing a black screen for her. Everyone else could see it fine. Couldn't get that much information out of them. So I turned up early morning, and I'm not a morning person. It's a good thing this talk is happening in the afternoon. Turned up with the biggest bucket of coffee, 8 o'clock in the morning, to find out what's going on. And the first thing I sigh is at the fact that they're using Internet Explorer. Bad memories. So Internet Explorer was the first thing, because we hadn't built this application in order to support Internet Explorer. We'd actively said we didn't want to touch it, and everyone's laughed for that very reason. We've all had nightmare experiences maintaining old browsers. Does anyone still have to maintain stuff for Internet Explorer? Please say no. Okay, I've got one. I'm sorry. But that wasn't the only thing. She had some really weird cookie settings that had been made in for another app. Still don't know why. And then once these were cleared, because I could see the error console, etc., bam, it worked. Magic. You need to know what the breakdown is of the browser agents. You need to know what browser people are using. You need to know what operating system is. You need to cross your fingers and toes that they're not using Internet Explorer. And obviously, RUM agents capture that. They capture the user agent information. And this is another reason why it's important. They also capture errors. It might seem obvious to us to immediately open the console within Chrome Developer Tools and see what these errors are. But if you're talking to individuals that are not from a software background, a lot of them are not really going to be able to do that. Or you're going to have to walk them through the instructions. And if you're dealing with an external user, that's quite difficult to do. So in those cases, we need to think about being able to track the error groups. So RUM agents capture that error information. They'll show you what the potential culprit is. Now, one thing you might be thinking is, well, what about minified files, Carly? Well, in those particular situations, if you make use of source map uploads, basically you'll be able to see the deminified code. So I don't have that in this example, but that's something to look for as well, which will make it far easier to debug rather than comparing the minified source. And then the last thing I have is sometimes we want to switch things off. Has anyone had to deal with a decommission before? It's not pleasant. So I had one situation which I did have to deal with a decommission. It was this aging .NET front end. It had been upgraded and upgraded, and we knew that it was going to take a lot of work to upgrade it to Windows 10 at the time, because this thing had been hanging around since the 90s. And we got so many assurances. Normally you go to people to get feedback and say, are you still using this? And the reality is that they kept saying, no, Carly, it's all fine, don't worry. But I then ended up checking. I got access to the access log data and found out that it was being used in one region in the world on bank holidays. So it was only a few times a year. And that was going to be really difficult to catch without data, without asking people. And also, you know what? It was going to cause probably a bit of a kerfuffle because I share a lot of the bank holidays with the same region. So I didn't want to get that call on a bank holiday saying, why is this thing switched off? Switch it on right now. So we need to think about the data in other ways aside from what we expect and what the application titles tell us. And an example here is for using page load duration by region. So immediately you'll think, well, this is for seeing where in the world, how long my pages are taking to load, and then being able to see if there's particular areas, perhaps with bandwidth and infrastructure considerations, where I can see that my app is running slowly. But actually, it tells me where in the world it's being used. And for this particular story, it would have been far easier for me to have access to this data. So we've talked about a lot today. We've talked about Google Lighthouse. We've seen how many people use Google Lighthouse. We've talked about synthetic monitoring and how using scripted browser monitors can give you an insight to some degree into what a particular application will function with on the expected workflow. And then we've talked about RUM and how the various different metrics can be used to solve some really common problems regarding performance and regarding whether a user is in fact using the features or segments of that application. This can feel a wee bit like spying because it is capturing such low-level information. And what I want to leave you with as a message is that you should be using these as a means of evaluating the systems that we're building, the React applications, the Node.js backends, anything at all. It's all about finding out how it's being used and making the application better. It's not meant to be spying on your colleagues and seeing if they're indeed using it. So with great power comes great responsibility. So use these as a starting point to ask innocent questions. Don't assume guilt when you find out that someone's not using your features. So I want to thank you all very much for taking the time to hear all about RUM agents and how you can use them, not just for error diagnostics, but for seeing if indeed the features are being used. I will be floating around if anyone wants to ask any questions, but otherwise, check out the code snippets I've got there. Come and chat to me at Twitter or the other obvious places, and I will catch you next time. Thank you very much.
Oh, such an incredible talk. Thank you.